afternoon and welcome to the Emerging Affiliation and Capital Support Models for Distressed Hospitals webinar, sponsored by Jones Day and Kaufman Hall. Our program today is scheduled to run from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you are having difficulty hearing me, please check to make sure that the volume on your computer is turned up all the way. You will be in a listen-only mode throughout the presentation. If at any time you have a question, you may submit them through the chat window located on the lower left corner of your screen. Type your question in the text box, then click the Send button. The speakers will attempt to answer those questions at the end of the webinar. If you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, please contact Beacon Live Customer Support at cesupport@beaconlive.com. That's BEACONLIVE.com. This presentation has been approved for continuing legal education credit, and the CLE credit information sheet available under the Handouts tab at left will provide you with information regarding the available credit. Applications for CLE credit in other states will be made as needed. Please keep in mind that CLE credit is not available when viewing the on-demand version of the webinar. There are several important steps that you must take to demonstrate that you are actively participating. Each participant must have registered individually for the webinar in order for your time of attendance to be recorded. If you have not individually registered for this webinar, please do so immediately by contacting Liz Murphy. That would be EMURPHY@jonesday.com. At one point during the webinar, a box will pop up on your screen asking you to confirm that you are viewing the webinar. You have up to 1 minute to confirm participation. If you do not confirm when the box appears, you will be denied CLE credit for the webinar. You must be logged on for the entire webinar. Otherwise, CLE credit will be denied. Within 24 hours, you will receive an email with a link to generate your CLE certificate. If you do not receive the email, please contact Beacon Live Customer Support at cesupport@beaconlive.com. It is mandatory to enter your bar number. If you cannot locate your bar number, please contact Beacon Live Customer Support for assistance. That concludes our housekeeping items, and we will now begin the program.
Thank you, Monica. This is Jeff Kapp, and I'm a partner of Jones Day, and we'd like to welcome you to the second part of a Part 2 webinar regarding emerging affiliation and capital support models for distressed hospitals. Our speaking panel today consists of Amy Ferber, who is a partner in the Atlanta office of Jones Day, and she's in our business restructuring and reorganization practice. Again, myself, Jeff Kapp, I'm a partner at Jones Day in the Cleveland office in the healthcare life sciences practice. And on the Kaufman Hall side, we have Anu Singh, who's the managing director, and Matt Robbins, who is a vice president. Our discussions today are going to take us through a quick review of our Part 1 materials. We'll touch on some of the key issues and explain how these issues play out in real life case studies. So you'll be able to apply the issues that we covered in Part 1 into real life factual situations. And we'll discuss emerging partnerships through the case studies, a case study with capital infusion, capital commitments to joint ventures, and asset sales and auctions. And then we'll tie everything together for you with some final thoughts on the market and the different models that we're seeing. As we covered in Part 1, there are a number of issues that have caused that inflection point for healthcare. And I would invite you to review Part 1 if you haven't had a chance to see it. If you go to the Jones Day website, and in the lower right-hand corner there is a YouTube icon. And if you click on the YouTube icon, and it will take you to a new website that has a lot of Jones Day materials, and down the page there's a section on presentations. And you can click on that and you can watch Part 1. So we won't spend a lot of time on reviewing this, but suffice it to say that there's a lot going on in the healthcare arena that has been driving a lot of the affiliation models and especially causing distress on some of the hospitals. There's a fundamental change in the way that people are being paid, the models and methods of payments, the relationship among the players in the healthcare industry, the insurers, the providers, and the insured. And there's a change in the risk allocation among the different players in this arena. We're also seeing a lot more involved patient choice and moving to the retail model where the consumers are becoming wiser and the providers are going to have to be more transparent. Another important piece of what we're seeing is new acquisitions, and there's a lot of M&A activity and joint ventures that are going on in the market in general and specifically in the distressed arena as well. And all of this is revolving around a move to be more vertical and horizontally integrated as a desirable outcome to face the challenges that are in front of our healthcare clients. So with that, I'll kick it over to Matt and Amy to talk about some of the key issues. This is a summary of what we talked about on our last presentation. Again, the presentation is available on our website, and I would suggest that you go there to check it out. And we are going to move through these quickly and just say that there's a lot going on in the healthcare industry with respect to fundamental changes for payment methods and models. The relationship among insurers and the insured and providers is changing, and the risks of payment are changing among the parties. Healthcare is becoming more of a retail model where individuals have a greater choice and greater transparency into the costs involved in healthcare. And there's a lot of merger and acquisition and joint venture activity due to a lot of the economic pressures that healthcare providers are facing. And they're facing competitive pressures not unlike those faced by other industries. So with that, I'll flip it over to Matt and Amy to cover some of the key issues.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. So moving to slide 5, a further review of the materials from part 1, where we spent a significant portion of that presentation working our way through different key issues that would either conspire to drive a hospital into a distressed situation or were key considerations for hospitals that were already in or nearing a distressed situation. We started last time with a hospital strategic physician and talked about the vicious cycle that can lead to the erosion of long-term viability. The loss of profitable business lines reduces access to capital, making investments increasingly difficult or expensive, resulting in dissatisfaction from internal and external stakeholders, which in turn makes the retention and growth of high-margin business lines very challenging. Warning signs will likely start to pop up across various parts of the organization. Market share erosion and payer mix deterioration start to illustrate that market essentiality over the medium to long term may be questionable. An inadequate cost structure that is either not efficient when compared to revenue expectations or is not flexible when related to utilization. These issues may have been hidden historically by high contribution margin services and are now sorely needed to be remedied. As performance and public perception and ultimately brand quality erode, the level of support from fundraising efforts, local politicians, and civic groups can wane. This further distances the hospital from its patient population, making it increasingly vulnerable. And these stressors start to build and impact the hospital's working capital and liquidity levels and its overall ability to fund needed investments for the long term. Timing is everything here. The sooner an organization recognizes warning signs and acts to address them, not only will there be more options available, but the quality and variety of exit strategies will also be the widest, as we'll discuss throughout the session today.
As you approach distress, obviously we've touched upon this in our last presentation, but governance becomes a concern for officers and directors of the hospital. So some of the fiduciary duties that many of you are familiar with include the duty of care, which is where directors must inform themselves of material and relevant information that is reasonably available and to act with requisite care with respect to the organization. Also the duty of loyalty, which means that directors must act in good faith in the best interest of the corporation and refrain from self-dealing. And a third duty, if you are working for a not-for-profit hospital in a director or officer role, and that is the duty of obedience. So the duty of obedience is applicable to not-for-profits, and it requires that directors act within the bounds of the law to comply with and to effectuate the charitable mission of the organization. These duties can change depending upon your jurisdiction on whether you're a solvent entity in distress or an insolvent entity in distress. But the key takeaway is that your duties are going to include duties to creditors when you actually approach insolvency. It shifts from just shareholders or market participants within your hospital to the actual creditors. Directors and officers are usually protected by the business judgment rule because you're presumed to have acted in good faith on an informed basis and in the honest belief that your action was in the best interest of creditors. It's rare that the business judgment rule will not be used to review potential fiduciary breaches of directors and officers. However, if there are actual conflicts of interest, hospital directors must be careful to show they can meet the entire fairness standard. This means that the burden would shift to the director to prove that he or she properly discharged his or her fiduciary duties. And that's definitely important in distress situation that could involve any actual conflicts with insiders, etc. Also, when we get down to it, Matt's already covered, you really have to look at that point in time at what your restructuring options are for a director. To do so, you'll see on the slide, you need to evaluate your core underlying business and determine whether some of your non-core assets have value. This will help predicate whether you can pursue options inside or outside of a bankruptcy. For example, can you sell any of the non-core assets? Can you enter into a joint venture or partnership with another hospital? And finally, communication with other stakeholders is key at this point in time. As Matt mentioned, you really have to have your stakeholders in line. Those will include your employees, your vendors, external opinions with politicians and the community at large, as well as your patients.
And now we'll transition into the case studies themselves, starting on page 7. At the conclusion of the first part of this webinar series, we discussed the framework that we show on slide number 7 at a very high level. And as we go through the case studies of various emerging partnerships with distressed hospitals, we will showcase examples that sit in each of these different quadrants. And as we talked about again during part 1, the transactional relationship and really the transaction currency for really all nonprofits, distressed and non-distressed, typically revolve around governance representation, organizational structure, and the role in the local market. All really softer issues as compared to for-profit companies where shareholder value might be at stake. Distressed entities have the same continuum that attempts to address business issues through a range of more or less integrated partnerships and balance sheet challenges which run the spectrum from capital support to asset combinations. Capital infusions and asset sales are the most clear-cut. They're both pretty firmly in the bottom left or the top right quadrants here, respectively, and there's pretty limited overlap with other structures. And as we'll see in our second set of case studies around service agreements, capital commitments, and joint ventures, these all typically involve a little bit of everything and are less rigid in their categorization. These are often customized partnership arrangements that address very specific needs or desires of the partnering parties. Our first case study here will discuss Daughters of Charity Health System in California, and we'll focus our attention on the capital infusion they received this past summer, but this could also be discussed as a broader case study since it's now transitioned into an asset sale with the announcement of their pending transaction with Prime Healthcare. And with that, we'll move to slide 8. Daughters of Charity has 5 hospitals across the state of California, 3 in the Bay Area and 2 near LA, and has long been a cornerstone of the safety hospital network in California. Given its Catholic mission and religious sponsorship, it serves a disproportionately poor population and not surprisingly has a very high reliance on Medicare and Medi-Cal, the California version of Medicaid. It has long operated on thin margins, but its strategic vulnerability really manifested following the 2008-2009 financial crisis and amid the changing healthcare market in California. Its hospitals were spread out geographically with strong local support, but insufficient scale on a statewide basis, and it lacked a strong referral network for patients. It had historically received significant governmental support at various levels in the forms of supplemental or at-risk revenues, but these started to come under pressure as well. As you can see in the graph at the bottom of the page, its operating losses persisted following fiscal year 2010, growing in almost every year and reaching almost $160 million in fiscal year 14. On a $1.4 billion revenue base, that's almost a 10% negative margin. These accelerating losses show their cumulative impact in the cash balances of the organization, which have dwindled from almost 100 days in fiscal 10 to only 30 days as of fiscal 14 and only 12 days as of December 31st, 2014. In 2012, DCHS signed various agreements with Ascension Health, but did not proceed with a merger or any kind of asset combination. Instead, in early 2014, DCHS announced its intent to find a buyer for the whole system and began soliciting bids for potential buyers. During this time, S&P downgraded their credit rating more than 6 notches to B- and kept the system on a negative outlook. On slide 9, as DCHS was proceeding with its sale process, its liquidity position continued to suffer. Prior to announcing Prime Healthcare as the buyer, it secured a $125 million tax-exempt private placement to help it fund working capital and other general operating needs, essentially a bridge financing to the expected sale closing date. It being tax-exempt was very important, and although most tax-exempt financings are typically performed with, for long-lived capital assets like hospitals or medical office buildings even, in this case, Tax Counsel determined that the funding of working capital, since the organization was cash flow negative, could be considered a tax-exempt use. However, the capital provided was short-term in nature, it was less than a year, it was high cost, and it came with significant restrictions on its use. The proceeds were not unrestricted cash, but instead were deposited into the accounts of the bond trustee, and DCHS was required to attest to compliance periodically with certain conditions in order to draw funds. The private placement investor wanted to provide DCHS with ample liquidity to fund its business until the sale date, but wanted very strict controls around the use of that liquidity. As of January 2015, the last date there was a public notice, DCHS had drawn $37.2 million of the available funds. In addition to the restrictions on use, the investor also included certain milestone conditions on DCHS to ensure that either the contemplated sale went through and the loan was repaid, or that there was a default under the private placement requiring the parties to sit down and renegotiate the deal. Just this past Friday, the California Attorney General approved the sale to Prime, albeit with several conditions on Prime going forward. And to stay within the letter of its lending agreements, Daughters and now Prime must close the transaction within 45 days of this approval. And now on slide 10, Anu will go through some kind of general observations here.
Thanks, Matt. I think you used the term bridge to a potential transaction, and that clearly is where we see the capital infusions most often being used. In addition to the Daughters of Charity example, there is a quote that comes directly from the consolidated financial statements and audit of West Penn Allegheny Health System as well. And in that instance, the capital infusion actually came from what was once a payer and then eventually the acquirer of the organization. And so we're seeing in some of the larger transactions in particular where there's a bridge to a potential full integration down the line, capital infusions are being used. Aside from these two examples, we do have anecdotal ones of ones that aren't public, and in two other instances, we've actually seen a payer provide capital infusions purely as a payer, whether that's changing the structure of the contract or providing some upfront consideration. We've seen payer support in the short term as a capital infusion, even when a transaction is not contemplated. And we've seen that on both coasts of the country, so this is something that nationally we're seeing a little bit more of. The point of this example is that the mechanism itself is financial, and the strategic rationale probably is not as clear if it's just that direct infusion without full integration soon to follow. In the models that we'll transition to next, we'll talk about strategic rationale and strategic mechanisms that are used to draw together the distressed hospital as well as other system partners.
And so our next discussions are going to cover two quadrants, and these are types of transactions that involve capital commitments and joint ventures, things like services agreements, and the joint ventures where the parties come together to improve service lines and things like that. And I will pass it on to Amy to give us our first example.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff. So on slide 12, we have an example of an academic and regional hospital system. In this example, we have a not-for-profit organization that leases and operates a hospital and related campus in a rural county in the east East Coast. So this facility has over 1,500 employees, over 80,000 emergency department visits, which is quite a large percentage for the state. 30% of those visits result in mostly uncompensated care charges. So you have it's a very poor county, and you have a lot of indigent patients. In 2013 alone, as you can see, we've got uncompensated charges, which amounted to over $85 million, and an operating loss that continues to increase and now stands at over $20 million as of 2013. The 2014 numbers aren't out yet, but it will be larger. So this hospital serves a large Medicaid population, and its current reimbursement, as we're seeing in many states, does not cover all costs. The facility had 2 series of tax-exempt bonds with a principal amount of over $30 million, and they were in technical default since 2013. So moving on to slide 13, what caused the regional hospital to be in such distress? And you can see from this slide that you've got several factors. You've got escalating costs of providing care to the community, Medicare cuts stripping the hospital of millions of dollars. It's one of the busiest emergency rooms in the state. There's more than $20 million in uncompensated charges, and you have a disproportionate share in the community of uninsured and underinsured patients. In addition, you're seeing greater competition in the healthcare field in this area. With the rise in standalone facilities and emergency care departments that are privately owned as well as publicly, there's just more competition for the payers who are coming in. Moreover, you have changes in the way that health care is being dispensed and paid for through the Affordable Care Act. Continuing on slide 14, what did the hospital do? They instituted a broad-reaching action plan that included a management services agreement with a related affiliate. They had workforce reductions. They had a third party come in, as I noted, to manage and operate the system, and then hired a restructuring firm to advise on the turnaround action plan. They sought additional funding from their local government and actually were successful in funding their outstanding bond debt from a tax issue, which was surprising given the state of the residents of those locations. As I noted, a very poor area. The conditions to funding from the county included that there would be appointment of members to the hospital board of directors, and that the hospital would further pledge to reduce their overhead and to evaluate and eliminate programs that weren't profitable and to cut services that weren't profitable. For instance, OBGYN can be a huge monetary drain on a hospital's resources. The bonds were retired, certain capital expenditure costs were paid, and then there was a one-time payment from the tax raise to cover around $10 million in outstanding costs for indigent care. So the local government in this instance provided incremental financial support, but the question is, what happens now? It was several $1 million less than the hospital requested, and although their bond debt has been defeased, there's little room for operating costs or capital expenditures on a go-forward basis. So in this instance, the hospital remains in financial distress, and their long-term viability remains unknown.
Moving on to slide 15 and talking about another example with more of a kind of a regional hospital, and then in this case, partly academic, partly just a super regional, Navicent Health down in Macon, Georgia, formerly known as Central Georgia Health System, which is one of the founding members of Stratus Healthcare, a network of 30 hospitals and 2,600 physicians in Central and South Georgia. Oconee is also a member of this health alliance, and Macon's about maybe 2.5 hours southeast of Atlanta, and then the Oconee main campus is another half hour, about 33 miles northeast of the Macon campus for Central Georgia. It's a large referral source for what's now called Navicent, and given their long history together, their geographic proximity, and their partnership in Stratus Healthcare, they have a very, very solid working relationship, and they have a number of different things that they partner on together. Oconee's performance had really dwindled over the years. It was in technical default on its rate covenant, so non-payment default, but in violation of its bond agreements in fiscal year 11 and fiscal year 13. It had evaluated alternatives to, rather than pursuing a strategic transaction, which would likely involve the sale of the main hospital, it had tried to find really any other way to fix its problems without pursuing that route. Navicent and Oconee were, even before these conversations started around the management agreement and capital support that we'll go into, they'd already been talking about opening an outpatient joint venture in Milledgeville, not far from the Oconee main campus. And at the same time, Navicent had entered into a consulting agreement with Putnam General Hospital, which is a district-owned hospital north of the Oconee campus. So that is not officially a part of the Navicent system, but there's a very close working relationship between Putnam and then the three other Navicent hospitals there on the bottom left of the graph. And you can see in the graph just where all these hospitals are located. They're all geographically very close, and the only other hospitals in this neighborhood are some HCA facilities in Macon. Moving to slide 16, this was a very tailored solution for both parties. Oconee's governance and management team were quite insistent on retaining local control of healthcare decisions and desired to find a solution that could provide them with the needed capital and expertise to do so. Navicent was very reluctant to acquire more hospital beds in its contiguous service area. It had a very large hospital in Macon and had these other hospitals in the area, and it was really more focused on developing joint clinical programs with Oconee, providing Oconee with the capital and operating flexibility it would need, and really to, in a way, scramble the egg and make the two organizations increasingly intertwined despite their distinct and separate corporate existences. The management services agreement came first, and that was in October of this past year. That focused on a number of topics. The outpatient joint venture that we talked about that had kind of been in discussions before these series of conversations was a very, very big part of this. And so were efforts to engage and integrate with physicians in the Oconee service area. Shared services were another place with low-hanging fruit, as a lot of the back office and other functions were either being duplicated at Oconee, or Oconee was understaffed and looking for expertise in certain areas and was now able to really rent Navicent's expertise in places like risk management and other competencies. Next came the capital support agreements, which involved several different legal documents and agreements between a variety of parties. Navicent's real aim here was to provide Oconee with sufficient capital to fund their share of the outpatient joint venture and other much-needed capital improvements at the main hospital. But Navicent didn't want to be an unsecured creditor, and as the bondholders had a revenue pledge and a mortgage lien, and Oconee was in technical default, this required Navicent to interface with the bondholder group to obtain various consents for different provisions and changes to the bond and security documents. And in return for their consent to give Navicent a position in the collateral structure, Navicent provided a 5-year guarantee of the scheduled debt service payments, so not accelerations of debt, but the scheduled principal and interest over time, and really restricted their termination rights to some very draconian events. That it really is, for all intents and purposes, a 5-year guarantee of those payments. And these negotiations took considerable time and effort, and they ran until January of this year, so just a couple weeks ago. On slide 17, we've talked about this earlier, and I think the two case studies that we've shared show this as well, but capital commitments, joint ventures, service agreements, these involve a number of different ingredients, each in varying size and importance, and rarely are the two partnership structures the same, but they will share a lot of similar dynamics and similar ingredients. And here on page 17, we've shown 5 of the major discussion points for the 2 examples we discussed, which are probably going to, in any kind of situation like this, you'd have to address these in some way. And Amy, do you want to run through your example?
Sure, definitely. And you can see in the academic and regional hospital case study that we gave you, these essentially flow through along with the bullets. So in the anonymous example, capital support was definitely and remains the most important piece of the pie for this system. Simply, regardless of how great your governance is, your joint ventures, your clinical affiliations and standing, you can't do it without capital support. And that's the dilemma they face at this point in time. Where do you raise the money from? You've defeased your debt, you've gone to a local government, you've reached out to the state, and still you have nothing. Moving on to governance, it's also important in this situation because it's a not-for-profit. You've got a volunteer board in a community very difficult to make sure everybody is apprised of their duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. With obedience, it can be difficult to determine what are your financial options when you have to weigh that against the charitable mission of the hospital. Sometimes those two things don't align. Financials are important. You've got to know where your revenue is coming from, how to build it, what are your core and non-core assets. Same thing with respect to joint ventures. Know what's in your community or outside of it that could actually build revenue for the system. And finally, and less importantly to this hospital, which is a super regional, is their clinical programming. It is a piece of the puzzle, but in the example that I gave, it falls far behind just necessary and requisite capital support to continue.
And on the Navicin Health Oconee example, capital support again was the most important of the group. Oconee had evaluated over the years a number of different routes to try to obtain incremental capital or to refinance its existing capital, and had really largely failed to gain market access at reasonable rates and on reasonable terms. So the fact that Navicin could come in and provide access to capital at what we thought was kind of a reasonable set of terms was actually very appealing to them. Governance and joint ventures, I think for this example, were the second most important. There was, different arrangements on the Oconee board to accommodate for the new Navicin relationship, and the joint venture that we talked about, which had really been in the works long before we started talking about these issues. That was, I think, in some ways, a lot of the leading, legwork had already been done around the relationship, and that ended up being a big part of the value proposition to both entities. Financial and clinical were probably the least important and least impactful with this example, although there are different things that the two parties are working on to try to find ways to bring incremental financial revenue or incremental clinical volumes. That was, I think, probably fourth and fifth on this list. I think with that, we'll turn over to Jeff and to Amy to talk through slide 18.
Sure. This is the emerging partnerships, sales, and asset auctions. It's kind of the all-in option, if you will. What you would consider the traditional acquisition mode, whether it's assets or a member substitution or a merger. And this is, depending on the viewpoint of the target, possibly a last resort if it's unable to make a go of it using other less integrated type of models. And with that, Amy's going to walk us through a real-life example of that.
Okay, great. So Forum Health is a case that both Jeff and I were involved in back in 2009. So Forum Health had 17 affiliates that filed for bankruptcy in March of 2009. Prior to filing, they were providing health care services in Northeast Ohio. They had 2 not-for-profit general acute care hospitals with a total capacity of 750 beds. And then, as you can see on the slide, they had 1 nonprofit rehab facility with 69 beds. At the date of the filing, over 700 physicians were affiliated with Forum, and in the prior year, they'd recorded more than 26,000 inpatient discharges, 539,000 outpatient visits, and 29,000 home care visits. So it was a pretty significant system within its community. During the first year of the bankruptcy, the debtors were repeatedly in default of their cash collateral order and continued to operate at a loss. So when we got to that, we decided on the creditor side, along with the debtors, what can we consider? Operational turnaround seemed unlikely, and thus the debtors began to consider a sale. So on the next slide, you can see, what do we have? We have a value-creating auction, and you've often heard of this, buying assets out of 363s. But it was unlikely at a point in time, or it seemed unlikely, that we would have any potential bidders. The debtors were able to find a stalking horse, Ardent Medical Services, with approximately a $70 million purchase price. The debtors assessed the market, had hired an investment bank in to look for potential purchasers, and really didn't see another bidder in the market. The creditor came up actually with a competing bid from an affiliate of Community Health Systems, which you all know is a large publicly traded hospital company. It was really unexpected, and I think shows the relevance of auctions in today's market. When you think that a super regional, oftentimes they can't be sold, but I'm amazed continually on how many people can come out of the woodwork to actually acquire a system if the synergies are right. So after the bids came in, the debtors actually ended up choosing Community Health Systems, who, as you can see, came up almost $50 million in purchase price for a final bid of $120. The sale was consummated in October of 2010, and as a result of the sale, Forum became Valley Care Health System of Ohio, which is now a for-profit hospital system. So that leads us to some key issues that you don't often see. One is the conversion from a nonprofit to a for-profit. As you can imagine, not only dealing with the Attorney General state law requirements, which were lengthy in scope, you also have community, which fears your status to a for-profit, believing that would endanger charity care commitments. So in response, Forum and CHS pledged to adopt an indigent care policy that would provide free or discounted care and to participate in Medicare and Medicaid for at least the next 5 years post-sale. That managed to assuage the Attorney General and also the key constituencies at stake. You also have state regulatory approvals, which I just touched on, with relationship to the conversion of a nonprofit to a for-profit. In addition to that unusual structure, you have to have Attorney General approval. So oftentimes you have to seek relief from Hart-Scott-Rodino as well for your noticing requirements. So in September of 2010, which was about a month after the AG reviewed the sale of the debtors to CHS, the Ohio AG approved the sale and did so in part because of the pledge to keep all 3 hospitals open and to invest at least $80 million in them in the long term. Finally, we had many unions in the Forum system. We had 3. They were recognized at the time of the bankruptcy. And interestingly, and I think you'll see this often not only in hospitals but other industries, labor costs represented the single largest expenditure of the debtors. They were higher than both the national average and the community average. The debtors were unable initially to reach agreements with the unions at 2 of the hospitals, and thus were unable to reach a negotiated resolution. As a result, in July of 2009, the debtors requested the authority to reject the continuing bargaining agreements pursuant to the bankruptcy code, and also sought interim relief under the bankruptcy code. In doing so, they pledged to the court that this would reduce costs by at least $10 million between the 2 unions. The judge granted an expedited hearing to consider the motion to terminate the CBAs, but ultimately decided that the request for interim relief failed. Nevertheless, before the evidentiary hearings that were scheduled later that month, the debtors were able to reach a negotiated resolution with both unions, and the court approved the agreement. So that staved off things for a while until the last union, the Ohio Nurses Association, discovered that the leading bidder was to a for-profit organization. As a result, they objected to the sale as a violation of the debtors' obligations under their particular collective bargaining agreement and as an attempt to circumvent obligations to the Ohio Nurses Association pursuant to the terms of the bankruptcy code. The debtors countered and said, look, contrary to your concerns, the buyer's actually obligated under the purchase agreement to honor the successorship provisions of your CBA. So you shouldn't worry, they're going to have to assume the liability. On that basis, in August, the court entered an order approving the sale and denied the union's objection on the merits. So that's what we have with Forum. So I'll turn it over at this point to Anu to cover Quincy Medical Center.
Thank you. Quincy Medical Center also had some of the same factors coming in. If we look prior to 2011 during a period of distress, sort of the epitome of what Matt discussed and sort of that cycle, that vicious cycle of performance challenges. And it does begin oftentimes with increased competition or something that's from a competitive position or a market standpoint weak or challenging to the organization in its current configuration. And what it leads to is on the bottom, the outcome, bottom left of this slide, limited ability to invest in programs, a CapEx that usually falls short of what's required to maintain, let alone advance or enhance the facility and the sites of care. And in this particular instance, just enough of a working capital challenge to be presented that it really was leading into the second box of some serious action needing to be taken. And in this instance, missing a bond payment triggered what turned into be a bankruptcy filing. In evaluating the turnaround plan, absent significant changes to the organization that couldn't come from its own sources and its own expertise, it was not going to achieve a turnaround. And so it really needed new capital in order to move forward as an organization. And that new capital in this instance came from a for-profit partner or acquirer, which was Steward Healthcare. And Steward was actively pursuing other hospitals in the area, developing a regional system. And as a result of its transaction, actually reduced the debt burden and dealt with a number of vendor obligations. However, between 2011 and 2014, one thing that couldn't be changed was that market factor. What the bankruptcy couldn't solve for was a relatively weak position for Quincy. And in the end, no amount of capital was going to turn around what was a market that had moved away from Quincy at this point. The patient base that it was enjoyed was very local, very focused, and avenues for growth were not likely to continue. So Steward made the call to actually wind down the operations, and currently this situation is in further discussions with the AG's office with what to do with some of the commitments made by Steward to keep this hospital open. And we'll just see where it goes. But clearly bankruptcy in this instance helped on one side of the ledger, and that being the internal or the capital side, but was not able to overcome the challenges in the market. And so as we look at 22 and a way to summarize these case studies, one thing that does jump out is what seemed and what was described very well by Amy as a number of internal challenges on the forum side. Those can be addressed through part of the restructuring. And positioning the organization to do something better in the market or do something different in the market with that capital source base or with that support of a financial sponsor can often be helpful. But in the Quincy situation, it was quite the opposite. While some benefits were achieved going through that bankruptcy, and in that case, emerging through a plan and a liquidating estate as opposed to a Section 363 sale, still the external challenges predominated. And so it's not to suggest that you can't overcome the external challenges. What it means to suggest, though, is that in certain instances of bankruptcy or restructuring, while they can focus on the internal side, have to position the organization for success to deal with its external factors as well. And in the case of Quincy, it just wasn't enough.
All right, now we'd like to wrap things up with a discussion of some of the solution points and things that you need to consider in this type of situation, and that's on slide 24. The first step is to basically either stop the bleeding or at least identify where the wound is and its severity. So determining short-term liquidity and capital issues is an important first step. And then you need to have a clear understanding of the internal and external factors to come up with an appropriate plan. And then those unique drivers for each situation is going to help you determine which dials you turn, because as we've illustrated and as history has shown, the number of variations that you can take in structuring a solution are multifaceted, and there are many different areas that you can go. So what you need to do is assess your own situation and determine the best model along the continuum of solutions that we've laid out. So for the last few minutes on slide 25, we have a summary of the various approaches to handling these issues. And I would turn it over to the panel to say if they'd like to discuss any trends that they see in the marketplace of where they think the market is going or in what situations the best approaches are.
Yeah, I think the most important thing before you start thinking about that is just understanding. I think as we've all hit on the various case studies that there are kind of balance sheet issues that can be addressed through the bankruptcy courts, or there are business issues that can be addressed, and that is often something that has to be tackled somewhat differently. A lot of I would say that the bottom left, so that capital infusion bucket, has always been there. And the top right bucket, which is more kind of a bankruptcy sale, some kind of an auction, has always been there. I think the newest ones are these ones in the middle that are a little bit more tailored, a little bit harder, because you need willing partners on a number of different fronts. But those are, I think, where it requires people to be a little bit creative. And I would say those, kind of the middle two case studies that we talked about today being, I just don't think we saw those, years ago. You would see them with solvent companies, coming together doing different things, but I think it's kind of one of the first times we've seen distressed entities, doing something a little bit more creative and partnering with new organizations.
I think the flip side of that, Matt, that's important to note is that we're seeing increased participation then from the system side in these transactions as well. So historically, you would have seen a distressed hospital really probably only go through an acquisition type structure. And the reason was health systems in the past grew for scale's sake. And so it didn't really matter where the market base of operations were, the concentrations were in a region. If we just look at how the for-profits have grown historically, they had no problem entering a new market or setting up a new hospital in a new state for the most of them because they were picking up a revenue base, and on their expense chassis, they could generate that cash flow to support shareholder value and increase shareholder value. I think what we're seeing is with more non-for-profits participating in this arena with distressed hospitals, they're customizing their approach to think more market-specific, more growth-specific. There's a lot more thought put into programmatic elements. And as a result, the structures are going to contort to fit that. And they're not always going to be cash on the barrelhead through an auction, nor are they going to be simply limited to a guarantee of debt. There's going to be some purpose put around either the management services that are provided, maybe the capital commitments that are provided, or those investments that are critical to either extending or enhancing joint ventures or other service lines.
Right, I agree. I mean, we're seeing more and more in the Southeast as well with respect to service agreements and capital commitments. I agree entirely with what Matt and Anu were saying. You still see many asset sales with respect to healthcare, but we're definitely moving into more creative territory at this point in time.
And along those lines, with more participation by the health systems in these types of arenas, are there specific geographic areas where there may be more or less opportunities, or what are the factors that health systems should keep in mind when they're looking at for these opportunities?
Sure. As far as regions that we've seen, I know that I'm seeing a lot of activity in Alabama, South Carolina, and Georgia. A lot of the southern states, which are typical of the Bible Belt, you have a church in every community. You also have a hospital in every community. And these systems have been more reluctant over time to merge. They maintain control. You're also seeing an increase in activity where there's been no Medicaid expansion by the various states, and so you're dealing with a lot of indigent care, both in the Medicare, Medicaid communities. You're dealing with reimbursement rates being lowered with respect to ACA. So that has certainly picked up from our perspective in the Southeast.
Yeah, I guess the one thing we'd add on to that is that, there are certain states where there are still lots of community hospitals, district hospitals. I think the states you mentioned, Amy, where there's just every community seems to have its own hospitals. Then there's states like Virginia where I think there's maybe 3 or 4 left. And I think when you start talking about, the people that are vulnerable here, the scale I think does matter, and being in a number of different markets does matter, and it creates kind of a portfolio effect. So the people who are going to be the most at risk when you start talking about these things are the community hospitals that just, by luck or whatever, they're just in kind of a rough neighborhood or a rough, part of the state where they just they don't have the diversification to actually be strong and grow. And I think a lot of that is kind of state by state and even like region by region of just, have community hospitals been able to persist for the last several decades despite all the winds blowing in the other direction, or have they been, collaborating together to join together or join other systems to grow? That is, again, kind of state by state specific.
And Matt, I think your comment combined with the slide that's on 25 and the orientation of these axes here is probably the best place for which we can come up with a summary of a lot of the content over this 2-part series, which is as we think about transaction structures, the left-right axis has always been there. Lower integrated to more integrated. And in fact, in a non-distressed context, you still have that access, and it's very relevant. I think as we think and evaluate about solutions for distressed assets, it's that north-south corridor that becomes that much more important. And particularly with distressed hospitals that either had some source of funding either through state mechanisms or through more constant bases of revenue and reimbursement, those forces are no longer supporting these marginally successful hospitals. And as a result, that capital support is going to be an increasing point of participation and lower forms of collaboration. And then eventually, if it's not enough, the asset combination is going to increase. And so it's a heightened sense of liquidity and capital tension that's being created for these community hospitals that didn't exist in the past because, quite honestly, we didn't have the same level of challenges.
Well, it's an interesting concept point, too, that you bring up, Anu, that a distressed organization might migrate around that page over time,
right.
Especially while they're trying to evaluate standalone options that, at some point in time that might need more capital support, and then they might have to move within that page as they find their ultimate home.
Well, great. We'd like to, on behalf of Jones Day and Kaufman Hall, thank all of our participants for joining us today. We appreciate you joining, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of the speakers. Our bios and contact information is in the slide deck, so you can reach us there. And with that, we will wrap. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for participating in today's program. If you have met all the criteria to receive CLA credit, you will receive an email within 24 hours. If you do not receive the email, please contact Beacon Live Support at cesupport@beaconlive.com. We apologize for any inconvenience today. It should not affect your CLE credit. So if you, again, could just give Beacon Live an email if you have any other questions. And have a good day.